Good evening. Nice to be back to NYMAS. The talk I'm going to give tonight is something of a spin-off of the book that I did called The Devil's Garden. So for those of you who are looking for additional detail, you can certainly go to the book. You'll find more scholarly appendices and things of that sort, and footnotes and all that other sort of wonderful thing. The actual presentation I have here is actually a presentation I gave at Royal Military Academy Sandhurst a few weeks ago for a World War II history conference. But the nice thing about NYMAS is that I'll have a little bit more than 20 minutes to give this talk. When I gave the same talk at Sandhurst, I was limited to 20 minutes, so it was something of a race to get through this. The theme tonight is German defenses at Omaha Beach. And the reason I got involved in this is that some years ago I did a short campaign history of Omaha Beach for Osprey Publishing in their campaign series. And subsequent to that, Osprey also has a series called Fortress, which deals with the history of fortification. And I had never done a fortification book for them, but they wanted one dealing with the fortifications on the D-Day beaches, not only Omaha Beach, but the British and Canadian beaches and Utah Beach. So I said, man, it sounds like an interesting subject, so I did the book for them. It's really a concrete and steel book. It's not that much about the campaign. It really is more about the concrete fortifications on the beaches. But as I did the book, it became clearer and clearer to me that the untold story of Omaha Beach is the German side. And many of you here are historians, so I'll explain one of the reasons why it is the unknown story. An awful lot of English language writing about the U.S. Army in World War II is based on what are called the Green Books, the official U.S. Army histories of World War II. What most people don't realize is that behind several of the Green Books were a separate series of studies called the R Series studies that were done by Army historians who read German. So for example, for the book on Market Garden, they did a half dozen studies on German forces at the time of Market Garden. For Sicily, they did 10 or 12 studies. For D-Day, they didn't do any. And so the Green Book that deals, the Green Book called Cross-Channel Attack, that was done on the D-Day landings, had no German component to it. There was nothing that the Center for Military History did on the German side. So the description of German motivation, German decision-making is largely lacking from that volume. There is some material there, but certainly not the depth that you find in, say, the Sicily book or the Ardennes book or some of the other campaigns. So I wondered for a while whether it would be possible to find material on German forces at Omaha Beach, because the divisional records for the 352nd Division are largely missing. Those for the 716th Division, also stationed there, are largely missing. But while working down in National Archive looking for things, I stumbled into several different record groups and found quite a bit of new material. And that formed the basis for this book and this study. The real issue with Omaha Beach, or one of the lingering historical dilemmas, is why was Omaha Beach so bloody? Why were the casualties at Omaha Beach so much greater than at the other beaches? The U.S. casualties at Omaha Beach in total were about the same as all of the other four beaches combined. Now the paradox, of course, is that Omaha Beach suffered the heaviest casualties, and yet Utah Beach suffered the lowest casualties. And so a lot of these explanations that have been more in the direction, oh, the U.S. Army did this wrong, the U.S. Army did this wrong. Well, why did the U.S. Army do it wrong at Omaha, but they didn't do it wrong at Utah? So one of the obvious answers is that the Germans did it. I'm not really going to claim tonight that the Germans are the only reason for the high casualties at Omaha. There are other explanations. For example, the poor performance of the naval bombardment, the excruciatingly bad performance of the Air Force pre-bombardment. I'm not going to get into those. So what I'm going to deal with here is the German side of the story. And to start off with, there's one obvious factor. Omaha Beach had far more German troops than any of the other beaches. And the reason for that, as I'll explain in detail a bit later, is that Omaha Beach was the only beach that was reinforced. Up through 1943, one division covered the four beaches, not counting Utah. The 716th Static Division covered the three British Canadian beaches and Omaha Beach. But in the early part of 1944, an additional division was brought forward that reinforced it. So one of the reasons, and I'll go into it in more detail, is sheer numbers. The second reason is geography, and I'm going to show some illustrations here to make the point. Omaha Beach differs fundamentally from the other beaches in the way that it's laid out. There's very, very high bluffs behind it. The other beaches are relatively flat. There were very, very clear fields of fire. Another reason, and one that hasn't come out very clearly in any of the published histories, is there was a great deal of undiscovered German artillery behind Omaha Beach. And I emphasize the word undiscovered. The 716th Division, the division that was already there since 1943, every single one of their batteries had been identified by Allied intelligence. Every single one of those batteries was targeted. In the most extreme example, over on the very far side on Sword Beach, you're probably all aware of the story of the Maryville Battery, a fortified battery near the Orne River. Well, the British actually conducted an airborne operation to take out that single battery. And there were other similar special operations to deal with some of the other batteries. On the American beaches, of course, Point du Hoc is the best known. That wasn't actually a divisional battery, but it was one of the well-established batteries. Because the U.S. didn't know that the 352nd was there, they didn't expect that their artillery would be there. So there was essentially a division's worth of field artillery sitting behind Omaha Beach. And the key issue here, and one that I'll explain in a little bit more detail, is Allied intelligence missed the fact that 352nd was on Omaha Beach. The Allied intelligence knew that 352nd was in Normandy, but they thought they were down at St. Lo. They expected it to be in the Army Reserve, not up on the beach on D-Day. And that had a great deal to do with what happens on D-Day. Looking at it now from the German side, Frederick the Great said, "Who defends everything defends nothing." I mean, that's a classic German military concept. That type of concept is incompatible with the Atlantic Wall. I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that the Germans in 1942, 1943, 1944 tried to fortify the Atlantic coast to prevent the invasion or to cripple the invasion. The thing that you have to keep in mind is the Atlantic Wall was not a program of the German army in the sense of its conception. Atlantic Wall was purely Hitler's idea. It was a political idea. It was a propaganda gesture, much like the West Wall. And then it got involved in internal Nazi politics, especially with Organization Todt, and became much greater than it ever might have been intended had the German army made the decision. So you have this strange situation of Germany investing a tremendous amount of money in the Atlantic Wall, while at the same time this idea of a linear defense along the coast is completely incompatible with German tactical doctrine. If you want to see what German tactical doctrine is, the easiest way to study it is the German response to Allied amphibious landings in the Mediterranean theater, starting with Sicily in July of 1943, following with Salerno, and following with Anzio. The German doctrine is you don't defend the beach, or if you have any defense on the beach, it's a trivial force that you use to protect against commando raids. What you do is you keep your reserves back behind the beach, you wait until the enemy strikes, and then you mass your formations and you attack the beachhead. That was seen at Sicily at Gela on the first and second day of the Sicilian invasion. It was seen several days after the landing at Salerno, and it started about a week after the Anzio landings, but went on for over a week. Very large panzer counterattacks. So that was the typical German response. And the reason is that the Germans understand you can't defend everything. You can't stretch your divisions along in a linear fashion, especially in the German situation in 1943-44 where they're on the Russian front and are short of manpower on the Russian front. So obviously they would have preferred a different tactic. Now the issue here is complicated by the fact that ultimately the tactics used at Omaha Beach were not the general German army tactics. They were the tactics imposed by Erwin Rommel. Rommel was brought in by Hitler in the autumn of 1943 to reinvigorate the invasion front. Up until the autumn of 1943, France had been held by minimal forces. Most of the forces that were in Germany were forces that were brought back from the Russian front for rebuilding. They were not defense forces in the usual sense. They were simply positioned in France for training. Had the Allies landed in 1942 or 43, they could have been used there, but their intention was basically rehabilitation and go back to the Russian front. In November of 1943, Hitler issues a directive. There's now going to be a new emphasis on the Western Front compared to the Eastern Front, and one of the essential elements is that Erwin Rommel is chosen to cover this particular sector of the front. He's given command of Army Group, what eventually becomes Army Group B. So it's up to him somewhat to make the decision as to what the tactics are going to be. Now, up until Rommel's arrival in the autumn of 1943, the German tactical doctrine was sometimes known locally as a string of pearls. The idea was, even with the Atlantic Wall, you can't defend every inch of beach. You can't defend every kilometer. You've got to stretch it out. So what the Germans tried doing is erecting strong artillery defenses, large coastal artillery batteries as a string of pearls along the coast, with very, very thin infantry defenses in between, very thin. Rommel takes a look at it and says that's fine if we know where they're landing. Because the other problem is that even though you could concentrate some of the artillery, you don't have an infinite amount of artillery. What the Germans concluded is that the Allies were most likely to strike for a port, either attack the port directly or near the port. And therefore, these string of pearls tended to be concentrated around ports. The German assumption was that any army landing in France needed excellent port facilities for logistics reasons. Therefore, the defenses were heaviest around the ports. Now, Rommel, of course, sits back and says, yeah, there's sort of a port at Gela, but it's not a great port. There was sort of a port at Salerno, but it wasn't a great port. And Anzio is no port to speak of. So obviously the Allies don't require a port. So he sees in the Mediterranean lessons different things than Berlin sees. And so he thinks that, that there's going to have to be changes in the way that the defenses take place. The first thing that Rommel does when he arrives on the Atlantic coast, because he's not only covering France, he's also covering the coast up through Belgium and the Netherlands, in fact, all the way up to the German border. He starts a series of tours. He starts up in Denmark and makes his way down along the Atlantic Wall and does inspections. And he arrives in the Grand Camp section on the 29th of January, 1944, and he comes out with this quote. He's talking to the divisional officers from the 716th Division. "This bay must be protected quickly against an Allied landing because the fate of Europe will be decided here." And what he told the assembled officers is that he saw a clear connection between the Grand Camp section and Salerno. Prior to having been sent into France, he had been in charge of German defense in northern Italy, so he was familiar with the Mediterranean lessons. Well, the Grand Camp sector is what we now call Omaha Beach. He was standing on those heights over Omaha Beach. He looked at it and said, this is probably one of those kind of beaches that the Allies land at. This looks an awful lot like Salerno. This looks an awful lot like what they've attacked in Italy. And the reason was there's good high ground up at the top that would make a good base for logistics operations. There's also several other attractive features that are usually not pointed out about Omaha Beach because people look at Omaha itself and not the neighboring areas. To one side of Omaha Beach is Port-en-Bessin, a small French port. To the other side is another French port, Grand Camp. And next to Grand Camp is the Vire River estuary, all of which are useful for logistics reasons. In fact, the Allies never do use them to any great extent. But from Rommel's perspective, they look like they were attractive enough that, hey, maybe this is another Salerno type thing. This is very important because what will end up happening is that Rommel is constantly asking Berlin for more and more forces. And more panzer forces are transferred in, but there's very, very few infantry divisions that are shipped in, especially first-class infantry divisions. There is at the time at Saint-Lô a Russian front division, the 352nd Division, which I mentioned before, that is being rebuilt and that is scheduled to go back to Russia. And after Rommel sees what he sees in the Grand Camp sector, he says, I want that division kept here. I want that division to take part in the defense of this beach. And he starts doing this in late January, early February 1944. The next quote I have up here is from a young lieutenant from the 352nd Division when they were sent up to the beach. And he came up with this in his memoirs. He mentioned this. "We expected the same sort of effort as the West Wall, what in the West sometimes called Siegfried Line. There was nothing significant on the whole beach." He's talking about Omaha Beach, or what we call Omaha Beach. You'll see the date is February, March 1944. February, March 1944, there's practically nothing on Omaha Beach. It's empty. One of the reasons that the Allies selected this section of Normandy is that the defenses are so weak. The other thing to keep in mind is February, March, the Allies have more or less finished their planning for the invasion. So the Allied planning for Omaha Beach is really more about Omaha Beach defenses February, March 1944 than they are June 1944. An awful lot of the work had already been done. As I pointed out, Rommel did receive permission to keep the 352nd Infantry Division in Normandy late in February 1944. This fact has not been widely reported. Until I wrote it in my book, I don't think it's ever come out. And the reason is that people just haven't looked in the right place. The right place to look is the German 7th Army War Diary, which does survive and is available down at National Archives. The War Diary itself doesn't mention this, but the War Diary has a series of appendices, Anlagen, which does mention all of the assignments of headquarters and stuff like that. And there's extensive detail in the appendices about the attachment of the various elements of 352nd Division between February, March 1944 and D-Day. What starts to happen is that the division is slowly moved forward as their training is completed. What you have to keep in mind about German infantry divisions, especially Russian front divisions, is they got reduced to what the Germans call torso divisions. The German practice was not, unlike the U.S. Army, was not to reinforce the division in the field. The division fought until it was decimated. And it became most heavily decimated, obviously, in the infantry regiments, in the line infantry companies. They would basically be essentially wiped out. There'd hardly be any infantrymen left. But the division would keep a torso. It would keep its command elements, its logistics elements, its artillery battalions. That torso would then be brought back to Germany or to France or to one of the occupied countries and rebuilt. They'd get new young infantrymen, the combat arms, the fusiliers, the other troops that would ordinarily suffer very heavy casualties. That meant that some elements of the division were in better shape, especially the artillery. So the artillery regiment attached to the division is the first element deployed. They start getting deployed up towards Omaha Beach in the late part of February, early part of March. The infantry units follow. One other minor detail, 84th Corps, the corps responsible for this sector in the German Army, and 7th Army decided that they wanted at least one infantry regiment from 352nd to be kept as the Corps Reserve. So when I describe this, you'll notice that there's one regiment out there. There's two regiments committed to the Omaha Beach and the neighboring area, but there's one sitting out in the back. Here's what it actually looked like. And this has never been published. Well, it was published in my book, but it hadn't been published before. The gray areas here show the actual deployments of 352nd during the training period from roughly October 1943 up through February, March 1944. It shows the grounds where the division was training. Now, up above it, the map symbols show where the unit was actually deployed came D-Day. And I'll make a couple points about it. This regiment here, Grenadier Regiment 916, is the one that's going to cause all the problems. The other regiment, 914 Grenadier Regiment, is down here. They're in the sector near the Veer River. This unit will become involved after D-Day. The only combat that it'll see on D-Day is mostly fighting against the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. Elements of that regiment will see fighting at Pointe du Hoc, but it basically doesn't see very much fighting on D-Day. The 3rd Regiment, which, as I mentioned, was kept in Corps Reserve, that, along with the division's Fusilier Battalion, forms a comp group. And in the early morning hours of D-Day, as the airborne forces are landing over towards Utah Beach, over in this area over here, these guys are taken and sent over on a wild goose chase to hunt down paratroopers. And that was the one lucky thing that happened to the U.S. Army on D-Day, because basically they go off on a wild goose chase in the pre-dawn hours, get scattered all across the countryside, have a horrible time when the invasion finally happens. Then they're called back. One of the battalions is sent over into this sector, one sent over into the neighboring British Gold Beach sector. But basically that regiment is not entirely ineffective, but largely ineffective because of that early order. So that was one lucky bit. The unlucky bit is this regiment sitting right there. The way that the Germans had the beach defenses set up, this is the deployments on Omaha Beach as of D-Day. And I'm just going to use a few terms here just to explain things. There were 3 companies. This arrangement was set up in 1943. When the 716th Static Division was there, this was the arrangement set up in 1943. So a Stützpunkt, a strong point, is roughly a company-sized defense position. So as you can see, there's 3 strong points on Omaha Beach. Within each strong point is a Widerstand nest, a resistance nest, or a defense point. That's roughly a platoon-size defense point, and this will be fortified. Now, what happened on all of the Normandy beaches, they were all arranged more or less like this. The original beaches, the British beaches, Utah Beach, had the same arrangements that they had had since 1943, basically elements of the 716th Division, roughly a company strength. So you can see that Omaha Beach, which is about 5 miles across, only had 3 companies originally of infantry. Now, what happens with the arrival of the 352nd is that each of these companies is reinforced, usually by a company out of the 914th Grenadier Regiment. So suddenly, the forces are double. But more than that, every division has additional units. They have anti-tank units, they have other type of support units. Elements of those drift in. So you get additional anti-tank guns, you get additional mortars, you get additional firepower. Rommel was absolutely insistent that as much firepower as possible should be directed at the beach. He didn't want the typical German tactics of keeping reserves behind the beach. He wanted everything literally up against the edge of the beach. So there's a tremendous amount of firepower there. The second point that usually doesn't come across in most accounts of the Germans in Normandy is that these static divisions, like the 716th, have two separate arsenals. They have their usual divisional equipment that any German infantry unit has, but they also have a static arsenal, and that's the weapons that are assigned to all of these bunkers along here. Large numbers of machine guns, pedestal guns, mortars, and other weapons. One of the problems that Allied intelligence had is that when they looked at Normandy, they said, it's a static division, it's got a crappy selection of captured booty weapons, they don't have very many weapons. Well, in fact, they had far more firepower than anyone appreciated because they had that additional element, those additional weapons that were peculiar to the static divisions along the Normandy coast. Now, to reinforce the point I made earlier, the aerial photo that's seen here on the left, that's what one of the strong points looked like in April 1943. Basically, there's nothing there. There were a few entrenchments, things like that. Starting in March of 1944, you can see all this. And I'll show you a few of the individual items. Practically all the fortification that occurs at Omaha Beach occurs from March to June 1944. When the Allies were planning, there wasn't much there. There were trenches, there were a few concrete positions. Practically all the concrete that goes in there goes in March, April, May, June 1944, after most of the Allied planning is done, which greatly complicates things on D-Day because the original plans did not assume that there was going to be such heavy defenses there. I'm going to put up some pictures of each of the strong points. These maps are rather hard to read, but it's more for just the visual impression. This is probably the worst of the defense nests from the American perspective. This is a strong point Vierville. For those of you who have read a lot of the D-Day literature, you'll be aware of Alex Kershaw's book, the Bedford Boys, about the National Guard unit from Virginia that landed here, Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, that was basically slaughtered here. The topography has an awful lot to do with that, and I'll show some photos in a moment just to make the point. But you can see from the illustration, this is the draw. This is the target that the U.S. is going for. Because of the bluffs, the only way to get off the beach is to get down through these draws, which are like ravines. Well, the Germans could figure that out. They take a look at the terrain and they pack all of their defenses around that. So each of these little squares, you can see the legend there, the little squares are bunkers, entrenchment lines, various type of obstacles. In the case of some of the others, you'll see extensive minefields and anti-tank traps. So you can see what's happening here. The draws themselves are the primary focus of the German defenses. This is an overhead photo I took back in January when I was over there for that recent PBS documentary, D-Day 360. And it shows several of the key defenses, and let me just kind of highlight what we have going on here. This is the draw itself. This is where the Allies want to get to. This is the only paved road off of Omaha Beach. So what the Germans do to defend it is they set up two resistance nests on the two hills on either side. So you have resistance nest 71 on this hill, which has a variety of anti-tank guns, machine guns, and mortars. You have W173 up on this hill overlooking it, which has a variety of mortars, anti-tank guns, and machine guns, firing down on the beach and firing down into the draw. And then blocking the draw itself is this 88 millimeter gun bunker, a double 50 millimeter gun bunker here, a 75 millimeter PAC 97-38 in the cave over here. And to prevent the Allies from getting off the road, they put an anti-tank wall across the road itself. Now, where the Bedford Boys land is right here. The second problem that the Bedford Boys have is that the tank company that was landed, or that was supposed to land to support them, is down in this area, down here away from this. And in fact, most of the tanks that land down here are knocked out by this 88 millimeter and this 50 millimeter anti-tank gun. Now, one of the points that I should make here, which is just kind of a detail for fortification enthusiasts, German bunkers on Normandy beaches and most of the Atlantic Wall do not point out to sea. If you look at this, you can see that the embrasure is pointing down along the coast, and the same is true of this one. Now, the reason for that is that the Germans realized that if you have an amphibious landing, you're going to have naval bombardment. Well, they want to protect the bunkers against naval bombardment. Now, the way they do it is that the outer walls are what the Germans call B standard. B standard is 2 meters thick steel reinforced concrete, which can withstand 8-inch naval gunfire, so roughly up to cruiser size. So these walls here are enough to protect against cruiser fire. There's also a wall here to protect the embrasure. So the only way that a Navy ship can hit this embrasure is at high tide by getting into the very, very shallow water and firing down into the embrasure. And that's true of all of these beachfront defenses. So when I say I'm not going to get into very much detail about the naval bombardment, part of the problem is that the naval bombardment, unless it involved a significant number of battleships with large plus 8-inch guns, wouldn't have done anything to these things anyways. And in fact, you can see on some of these bunkers where they were hit by destroyer fire, typically by 8-inch naval fire. I'll give you an example, a specific example right here. This is that 88 millimeter bunker that I showed a few moments ago. This is what it looked like right after D-Day. There's the gun, right? In fact, there's the gun barrel right there. There's the embrasure. I'll point out another detail. To camouflage this particular bunker, the Germans created a wooden false porch. Where this bunker was located, there had been a casino. The French beaches, they had a lot of vacation spots there. They had a casino located there. When they put the bunker in there, they created a false porch to confuse the Allies, thinking, oh, the casino's there, we don't have to worry about that. You can see here that this thin wood is hardly at all disturbed. That bunker was never hit from seaside. It was hit by destroyer fire and by tank fire. And there's some mystery as to what finally killed this bunker. This was one of the longest living bunkers on D-Day on Omaha Beach, and probably the most destructive. It hit a number of LCTs, hit large numbers of landing craft. It kept all the tanks away from this section of the beach. It was in an ideal place to hit that particular section of Vierville. Best guess, and I'll show you some evidence in a minute, is that in the later part of the morning, 2 tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion that had landed further down the beach from here, they charged this bunker. In the course of that, one of the tanks was knocked out. One of the tanks, though, did fire and hit the gun. As the tanks were charging this, a U.S. Navy destroyer was sitting off the coast trying to find targets. It saw what the tanks were doing. It followed up with 5-inch gunfire. And here's the evidence. For the PBS documentary, we were allowed to get into this bunker. This bunker has been sealed up since World War II. We got permission from the French government to get inside of it. We took the grating off of it. And when I got in there, it suddenly became evident that there was destruction or there was damage from 2 sources. This wall that was caved in, this kind of stuff is not tank fire. That's 5-inch naval gunfire. The rounds went through the steel reinforced concrete wall. This would be an ammunition storage area right behind it. Went through there and back into the wall behind. But there's also extensive evidence of tank fire. There's a tank round hit there. There's another one down here. There's one up here, and there's machine gun fire hits on the side of the gun. So the mystery is solved to the extent that we now know that that particular gun was certainly hit by both naval fire and by tank fire. And quite honestly, considering the confined space in there, any crew there would have been killed by either the naval gunfire or the tank fire. But it was probably a case of where it was knocked out by both. Moving down the beach into the center of the beach, this is Zaloga. This was the strong point between the 2 landing American infantry regiments. The 116th Regiment from the 29th Division landed up at Vierville, which we just saw. This was in between. Then the next one down, which I'll show in a moment, the Colville Draw, that was attacked by the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division. So this area was the responsibility of both divisions. So there were elements from the 29th Division that landed here. In fact, General Coda and his crowd came over the bluffs here, and elements from the 1st Division came down in and across here. When I was talking about topography, this gives a very good indication of what the U.S. forces were facing. There's very, very high bluffs immediately behind the beach. And you can see here that the draw that I was talking about, the Saint Laurent draw, is roughly down in there. Colville is way down there. So once the GIs got up to the shingle edge here, they were facing German troops in the heights here firing down on them. Where the U.S. succeeded best was where the German defenses were the weakest. Now, as I mentioned, let me go back to the map. You can see that the German defenses were very, very heavily concentrated in the draw itself. In fact, on the heights up above, there are very, very few German defenses. So it's not surprising that General Coda got over in this section where there were very, very few defenses. And likewise, 1st Division tended to get through the defenses mostly in this area here. That's an overhead view of what the Saint Laurent draw looked like on D-Day. You can see there's a very large anti-tank trap going across. It's this thing here, which prevented tanks from getting down into this gully. And you can see some of the bunkers. The map that I showed a few moments ago isolates them in a little bit more detail, but there's quite a few in that area. Let's jump down one more. This is Colville. This is the Colville draw area. This is where 16th Infantry Regiment of Big Red 1 landed. For any of you who are interested in the fighting by the 1st Division, John McManus has a brand new book out on Big Red 1 on D-Day, a very good book. So if you're interested in this particular sector, that's the thing to get. This is one of the densest set of defenses on Omaha Beach. It's also one of the best known, and the reason it's well known is that this strong point here, WN62, two young German soldiers in that strong point survived the war and wrote their memoirs, Heinz Severloh and Hans Goeckel. And so it's the only area of Omaha Beach which is well known from the German side. They're the only ones who wrote full-length memoirs. So we know pretty much what happened on Defense Nest 62. And basically what happened is the 16th Infantry Regiment landed here and took awful casualties. Some elements of the 16th landed further over and skirted up through here and never attacked directly into WN62, the reason being that there was a big nasty minefield here that they bumped into, and so instead skirted through here. And there was also another group of troops that landed down here below the cliffs and managed to get up here between the minefields. So the German defenses worked quite well. The only German defenses that didn't work very well on D-Day were right here, WN61, and the reason is, unlike all the other German defenses, this is down at sea level. It's right low in the beach. This defense and this defense nest are both on the high grounds. They're very hard to get to. WN62 is in the low ground, was fairly easy to get to, and started suffering losses immediately. So, for example, that 88 millimeter gun bunker that I showed you earlier on that was way down the other end of the beach down in that direction. There was a corresponding 88 millimeter gun bunker right down on this side of the beach. The idea is that you'd have enfilade fire and those two 88s could cover the whole beach. They could destroy any tank moving down that end of the beach. Well, in the opening minutes of the fight, one of the tanks that did land here fired into that bunker and knocked out that 88. So that 88, one of the central defenses in this area, was knocked out right at the beginning of the fight. Several of the German pedestal guns, if you remember that opening shot at the beginning, the title page that I had, that was a 5-centimeter pedestal gun. It's a version of the 50 millimeter gun that's in German tanks like the Panzer III. When it became obsolete, the Germans took 1,800 of them, mounted them on pedestals as dual-purpose weapons. They could be used for anti-tank fighting, but primarily they're intended for shooting at craft, at landing craft, at LCVPs and LCMs. Very, very lethal. One of the reasons that all of the engineer breaching teams here suffered such high casualties were these pedestal guns down along the beach. But the pedestal guns down in this part of the beach were close enough that the GIs could get in and attack them, and that's what happened to those particular pedestal guns. Here's an aerial of the anti-tank ditch, and this is the 88 millimeter gun bunker. And as you can see, it's designed for enfilade fire down along the beach. That later became a medical center on D-Day. They pulled the gun out and converted it into a unit for the local medical battalion, for the division medical battalion. This photo is just sort of intended to further emphasize the point of how the topography influenced the battle. You know, once again, the Germans are sitting up in the high ground overlooking the beach. This is a view from one of the two bunkers in Resistance Nest 62, the ones that I just mentioned a moment ago. They were armed with two World War I era Belgian 75mm guns. Doesn't sound very impressive, but when you're sitting up on the heights like this, firing down, they had a great field of fire. Both those guns lasted into the morning. One of them was knocked out around 9 o'clock, one was knocked out around 10 o'clock, both by tank fire. And if you go in those bunkers today, there's 20 or 30 tank hits on each of those bunkers, and there's destroyer hits on them. They took a tremendous amount of fire. Although, strangely enough, both bunkers only had 4-man crew each, so there were 8 men in there. There was only 1 man out of the 8 killed. All of the other crewmen were injured, but only 1 killed, even though the bunkers were hit multiple times by both tank and destroyer fire. This is backing up a little bit. We saw the view through the embrasure. The embrasure's over on the other side of the bunker. You'll see that scene again. There's WN-74 way down there. There's Vierville Draw there. There's the St. Laurent Draw here. This is Colville right in front of us here. And this is the Engineer Memorial. This place was oftentimes called Engineer Hill because one of the Engineer Special Brigades, after it landed, it used this hill as its base of operations. So the memorial to the Engineer Special Brigade is located there. And, but once again, it emphasizes the point of the effect of topography on the fighting. And to give an even clearer view, this little bunker here was not actually an official bunker. The Germans, most of the bunkers that we saw were based on standardized plans. Organization Todt had standard plans for different kind of bunkers. If you wanted an 88mm bunker, you got an architectural plan, you follow the architectural plan, that's how you did it. In some cases, they did little improvised bunkers. This was a little improvised bunker. This was the bunker of the forward observer of one of the battalions of artillery of the 352nd Division. So this crappy little bunker was one of the most dangerous spots on Omaha Beach. The reason is a young lieutenant, the battery commander, was actually sitting in there with a field telephone linked to a command post back a ways and then in turn to his battalion. And so he was sitting right over the Colville Draw area of the beach calling in artillery fire the whole morning. So he could clearly see what was going on. And as I'm going to point out in a moment, all the targets there were pre-registered. Now, the other reason I'm showing this particular scene is there were 2 German machine guns set up on either side of this particular bunker, and coincidentally, they were manned by those 2 young German soldiers who wrote their memoirs, by Goerkel and by Severloh. So for anybody interested, you can find accounts of these guys. Now, the interesting point is there's a lot of mythology around Severloh now. He's sometimes called the Butcher of Omaha Beach. He claimed he killed 2,000 American troops, blah, 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 blah. It's not very likely true. We know how many rounds of ammunition he had. We know what the casualties were there. It wasn't 2,000 men. We also know the distances involved, although this is certainly the sort of thing where crew-served weapons can be quite lethal. In fact, the troops were the better part of well over 1,000 feet away, and most of the troops were out in here. An awful lot of the casualties on D-Day were not caused by rifle and machine guns. They were caused by mortars, and they were caused by artillery. If you go and you take a look at World War II statistical research, operational research that was done after the war, on average, about 65% of casualties were caused by artillery. And the weapons that were so lethal here were those pedestal guns, the mortars. The mortars were especially bad, and the 105mm field guns that the divisional artillery had 3 or 4 kilometers back behind the beach. The machine guns certainly contributed to the carnage, but it was certainly the larger weapons. A few statistics about what kind of firepower was directed against Omaha Beach. There were about 850 troops in the immediate Omaha Beach area on the German side. Now, to give some point of comparison, on the other beaches, the British-Canadian beaches, there were an average of 250 to 300 men. So there were well over twice the number of men on German soldiers on Omaha Beach. They had about 1.2 million rounds of small arms fire, or small arms ammunition. Most of it was fired off. If you read the memoirs of the few memoirs that we have, both of those 2 young German soldiers who I mentioned, both of them said they fired off all the rounds they had. The standard unit of fire for a German machine gunner was 12,000 rounds, and Severloh said he fired off 12,000 rounds, then got some additional ammunition. And Goerkel says that he fired at least 10,000 rounds in the morning. Now, some of the real killers were these things. There were 18 mortars, mostly 81 millimeter French or French booty mortars or German mortars. There were 15 direct fire guns, both those 75 millimeter field guns and the 50 millimeter pedestal guns. There were 20 pieces of field artillery, and I'll get into those in a moment, ranging from 105 millimeter to 150 millimeter. There were 38 Nebelwerfer artillery rocket launchers, mostly located in the Saint Laurent draw area. In total, there was about 420 tons of artillery munitions directed against Omaha Beach, and most of it was fired off in the morning. When you start seeing German accounts, and there are reports back from the beach, they start complaining at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, we're running out of ammunition, we're running out of ammunition. Standard German unit of fire is for 3 days of fighting. The Germans on Omaha Beach used it in less than 4 hours. Not in 3 days, but in less than 4 hours. And if you look on the other side at American casualties, if you look at the casualties suffered by the 16th Infantry Regiment, the 116th Infantry Regiment, both regiments suffered over 1,000 casualties. The next wave of reinforcement, the 15th Infantry and the 115th Infantry Regiment, suffered casualties in the hundreds. So it was those first waves that came in and got hit by this stuff that suffered the severe casualties. A point that I especially want to make, the Germans are professionals about this. They've been fighting a war for 4 years. They know how to use field artillery. They know that field artillery is the killing arm of the infantry division. They pre-registered the beach. Before the Allies landed, months before, they had sat down there, they had picked out fields of fire, and I'll show you an example. I found this map down in the National Archives, and in a minute I'll describe how I found it, but these are what the Germans called Zielpunkt, aiming points, and this is Omaha Beach. We have Colville down here, there's Vierville up there, and these are the pre-registration points. And basically that young lieutenant sitting in that bunker would say, you know, I need 50 rounds on Frida. And the only reason that this is advantageous is that it's very, very quick to get the orders in and very explicit about where they want the artillery dropped. And he can say things like, I need 50 rounds north of Frida by 100 meters, and he'll get the adjustment from his battery. So this was critical. There were similar steps done with some of the other crew serve weapons like the mortars. And for any of you who saw that PBS show, we discovered that actually one of the Tobruks still has the pre-registration mark. What they are is they're little paintings. So the crew could sit down there protected inside the Tobruk and look at the little paintings, and when they got the field telephone thing saying we need fire here or here, they could just aim it based on those little paintings that they had around the lip of the Tobruk, and then on the lip of the Tobruk also was what the range was to the target, and they could therefore very accurately target from the security of their Tobruks. This actually shows where the German artillery was. Those are all those strong points that I mentioned. The artillery was located back here behind the main coastal road, and I've got the various captions here. These, of course, are the 105 millimeter field guns, the standard divisional field gun, and the heavy battalion with the 150 millimeter. That particular battalion was stationed over in this area. It was stationed over here because it was supposed to support both regiments. It was trying to support the regiment that was over here in the Veer River estuary and support the Omaha Beach area. And then there's other stuff around in there. There's 88 millimeter guns. Rommel insisted that the flak units move as far forward as possible so that the flak units could be used for artillery fire as well as anti-aircraft fire. And as I mentioned, there were Nebelwerfers. There were the heavy artillery rocket launchers located there. And with that, I think I'm ahead of schedule, although I have two bonus slides if we don't get enough questions. So I'm going to leave it. Oh, that was good timing, 5 to 8. Oh my God, that was wonderful. Okay, so we'll. I've saved two bonus slides because I sometimes get questions in particular areas, and I'm trying to anticipate what you might be asking about. Okay, so I guess we have to wait till the mic gets to whoever.
Thank you for an excellent talk. And one of the things the British like to say is that the American effort at Omaha Beach and Utah, I guess, as well, that one of the problems was they didn't have Hobart's funnies. So I wonder what's your opinion on that?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. One of my favorite subjects. No, that's all a myth. I actually, besides the D-Day 360 program that you may have seen on PBS PBS that was on Tuesday night, there was another one on Nova the following night on the sunken ships or whatever, and they went in to ecstasy about Hobart's funnies. It's all myth. The first thing that I'd say is for any of you who are serious into the subject, get Rich Anderson's book that came out from Stackpole last year called Cracking Hitler's Atlantic Wall, where he goes into quite a bit of detail about Hobart's funnies. The first part of the myth is that the U.S. refused to use the funnies. There's two obvious problems with that. Number one, the U.S. Army did request funnies. In February 1944, the U.S. Army, First Army, what was Bradley's headquarters, requested 50 crab flails, those anti-mine tanks. They requested 50 Sherman crocodiles, the flamethrower tanks, and they required a bunch of other accessories. There were other funnies, there were things called porpoises, these type of devices that you tow behind the tank. In any event, they gave this laundry list of stuff that they wanted in February 1944 to Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters, said, we want this stuff for D-Day. How much of it did they get? Zero. They got none of it. The first of the flails gets sent into Normandy in July. The crocodiles get in August. Only 4 arrive. They're not used until the Rhine crossing in February 1945. So the first part of the myth is false because the British historians haven't bothered to go to the U.S. National Archives and look at the U.S. records. So there's part one. Part two is that the performance of the funnies on D-Day on the British and Canadian beaches is grossly exaggerated. A lot of the funnies that were used really didn't do what they were supposed to do, and there's a variety of reasons for it. If you watch the TV program, the flail tanks. Flail tank is a great idea if you're facing mines on the beach. How many mines are on the beach? None. You can't put mines on sandy beaches because the fuses will be damaged by water immersion. So there were no beach mines, so those flail tanks didn't do any good. The petard launchers, everybody says, oh, they've got this wonderful 165 millimeter high explosive thing to go and attack the bunkers. Those bunkers are designed to protect against 8-inch direct fire artillery. An 8-inch cruiser gun will penetrate a hell of a lot more concrete and steel than a soft mortar round like that will. All that mortar round off an AVRE is going to do is scab off the concrete. Now, those AVREs are successful, and I'll tell you the reason why. The main advantage of Hobart's funnies is not all that baloney crap about all those weird devices. It's the fact that the British had twice as much armor on their beaches than did the United States, because what ended up happening on D-Day is every one of those British assault beaches got their battalion of tanks. And I'm going to use the term battalion here. That's the U.S. term. The Brits would call them regiments. They got regular gun tanks, the DD tanks, just like what appeared on the American beaches. In addition to that, they got the Remy battalions. They got those Hobart funny battalions that had all that stuff. Well, even if those gimmicks didn't work, you still have all that firepower. The Sherman flail tanks that land on the beach, even if the flails don't do anything, you still got a good 75 millimeter gun. Even if those AVREs are not able to penetrate the concrete, those petard rounds are wonderful if you shoot it into the embrasure of a bunker. So the funnies were effective on the British beaches to the extent that it gave the Brits more armor, but the funnies in the sense of specialized engineering equipment really didn't accomplish very much. And the problem that the Allied planners had is that there were a limited number of LCTs. The U.S. Army would have liked to have had more tank support on D-Day in the early morning hours. There weren't enough LCTs. So the reason for the disproportionate amount of armor has to do with the amount of LCTs, but the other reason, of course, is they know what's behind the beach. The Allied intelligence does know that the Germans have an armor unit, the 21st Panzer Division, sitting behind the British beaches. So there's a lot more emphasis on getting armor ashore for the Brits, because they know that the Brits are going to be fighting an armor battle quite quickly after they make the landings. So there's much more emphasis in the British sector to get tanks ashore because they know that they're going to be facing German armor. So that's a contributing factor. But the myth about, number one, that the U.S. refused it, that's absolute nonsense. And number two, that this stuff would have been super effective. Let's back up and make a third point. All the U.S. armor on Omaha Beach on D-Day were funnies. It was DD tanks, a British concept, although I might add that the majority of DD tanks that landed on D-Day, not only on the U.S. beaches, but on the British beaches, were U.S. built. But it was a crappy idea. Giroux from 5 Corps had said that they wanted to do the same thing that was done down in the Med Theater, which is deep wading tanks. I don't have any pictures up here, but the difference is the DD tanks swim in. You drop them 5,000 yards ashore or from the shore, and they swim in. And of course, in the meantime, they sink. The The tactic that was used down in the Med was what's called deep wading. You put big trunks up on the back end. The LCTs come in to relatively shallow water. They dump the Sherman tank in there. The big stacks act as a snorkel. They can drive up on the beach. Well, guess what? On D-Day, guess what tanks survived? The deep wading tanks survived. The DD tanks go and sink. The GIs who were operating those 2 battalions of tanks referred to them as 30 tons of steel in a canvas bucket. They were not very popular. So the funnies that the U.S. did use, quite honestly, were one of the major problems. It was the reason that 741st over in front of Colville Draw lost so many of their tanks. In contrast, 743rd, the other one down by Vierville Draw, the Navy commander of the LCT flotilla insisted on dropping the tanks off on the shore, did not allow the DDs to swim in. He dumped the DDs right on the shore. Guess what? They all survived. The best funny on D-Day, which you'll never hear about on the stupid TV programs, was the dozer tank. The U.S. had 16 dozer tanks dropped off there. Now, the reason that dozer tanks are great is that unlike the British gimmicks, they're multi-purpose. If you've got to push obstacles out of the way, it works. If you've got to fill in anti-tank ditches, it works. Great, great, great thing. Guess what? If you go into modern tank units today, guess what they have? Dozer tanks. They don't have those stupid flails, any of that other stuff. There was one problem, though, with the dozer tanks, and this doesn't come across in any of the histories either, but it does. I'm a tank nut, so I spent a lot of time looking at this stuff. The layout inside the LCTs is to have 2 deep wading gun tanks up in the front on wooden platforms so that they can fire, and 1 bulldozer tank in the back. So what happens when the LCTs on D-Day at Omaha Beach come up, they land, the tanks, the 2 deep wading tanks have to back off, drive down through the center path, then the second one comes through, and then the dozer tank goes off third. Well, now the problem is, if you remember those pedestal guns I was talking about, maybe they don't get the first tank, but I can guarantee you that by the time the dozer gets off, it's dead meat. And so what happens on D-Day is that those wonderful dozer tanks that would have been very useful mostly get nailed. They either get nailed on the LCT itself or they get nailed coming off the LCT. So instead of there being 16 dozer tanks on Omaha Beach on D-Day, there's only a handful. Or a handful of survivors. There's a lot of wrecks.
Yeah, great stuff. The erudition and knowledge. It's as part of a commemoration, I think it was the LA Times had they put their front page from 70 years ago. They had a great map showing the lines of attack going from England to the 5 beaches, and they also had a couple of lines up the coast going from southeast England into the Pas-de-Calais. Obviously, that fooled everybody, having Patton's phony army up there. It's widely known, but I always thought it was kind of undervalued. It kept literally hundreds of thousands of men and hundreds of panzers from moving out for a week or two, and it might have been a much nearer thing had they been moving a lot sooner. I just wanted to get your thoughts on it.
The Germans did have a tremendous difficulty with the Allied invasion. I mean, people underestimate the strategic advantage of navies, the strategic mobility that navies offer. And the Allies, Britain and the United States especially, have this wonderful advantage of strategic mobility. They can attack anywhere. I mean, as you know, the original Overlord plan was not only a strike at Normandy, it was the strike in southern France. Dragoon was supposed to happen on D-Day also. It wasn't supposed to happen in August. They were both supposed to happen simultaneously. They couldn't be done because there wasn't enough LSTs, there weren't enough LCTs. So the Germans faced this tremendous difficulty. They have all this coastline to defend. And so what do? You can't defend it all. So Pas-de-Calais was heavily defended, although there's not really very many panzer divisions up there. Where the panzer divisions are kept, that's another argument. I didn't get into it tonight because the panzers have nothing to do with the story of Omaha Beach. But there was a very, very big argument that went on in the amongst the senior German commanders in the fall of 1943 and into the early winter of 1944 about what happens with the panzer divisions. There had been practically no panzer divisions in France except for refitting units up until early 1944. Hitler orders large numbers of panzer divisions moved into Normandy to deal with the invasion threat. What do you do with them? They actually set up a separate command under Gerhard von Schweppenberg called Panzer Group West. It later becomes 5th Panzer Army. That's the Strategic Panzer Reserve. That's located mostly in the Paris area. And all the East Front guys, von Schweppenberg, all those guys, they say, we want all that stuff left back around Paris. Then when the Allies land, because we don't know where they're going to land, maybe it'll be Pas-de-Calais, maybe it'll be Normandy, maybe it'll be Brittany, maybe it'll be the Bay of Biscay. They don't know. So they want to keep all those panzer divisions concentrated around Paris. And then when the Allies land, they'll move the panzer divisions forward. Rommel's argument is that the East Front veterans don't understand Allied air power, which is certainly true. He says you can't do that. You've got to move the Panzer divisions. You have to commit somewhere, because as soon as Allied air power gets involved, you're not going to be able to move the Panzer divisions forward. And guess what happens? A couple days, couple weeks later, as the Panzer divisions are trying to move forward to deal with the British over in the British sector, they get nailed by Allied air power. What Allied air power is especially destructive of isn't the tanks, it's their logistics tail, all their trucks and all the stuff that they need to move fuel and ammunition and supplies. Very vulnerable to air attack. And so they get really, really roughed up. But in reality, the pot of clay does contain some very, very good German infantry divisions, but the real reserve is not up in the pot of calais. It's down more into central, I shouldn't call it central France, but in the Paris area. And the idea is, of course, that it's a mobile reserve. But Hitler could never make up his mind, so he went a little bit both ways. He let Schweppenberg keep some of the divisions down in that area, but he did give Rommel a few divisions. So, for example, right behind Sword Beach is 25th or 21st Panzer Division. Just as a bit of historical curiosity, Rommel wanted 12th SS Panzer Division put behind Omaha Beach. So stop to think of what Omaha Beach would have been like if Rommel had all of his wishes. He wanted 12th SS Panzer Division sitting there on D-Day.
Did Rommel, in building up the defenses of Normandy, did the Germans use slave labor from the concentration camps?
I wouldn't use the word slave labor. I'd use the word forced labor. If you look at the German exploitation of European labor forces, the use of what I'd call true slave labor, I mean people from the concentration camps or people who had a high probability of dying doing their job, for example, the Nordhausen missile plant or those sort of things. That tends to happen later in 1944. In the fall of 1943 into 1944 when this construction is going on, a lot of this construction is actually done by French architectural firms that are subcontracted to German firms. And they use a little bit of local labor, but not a lot of local labor because they were very afraid that the French were going to go and rat about what they were building. So they actually brought in the case of Normandy, they brought in a lot of Moroccan workers from French North Africa. Well, I shouldn't say they brought them in. They were North Africans who were living in France from the French colony. They were brought up there because it was felt that they wouldn't talk to the Allies the way that the local French would. So there were a large number of Moroccans being contracted by the French. I wouldn't call it slave labor. They were being paid. I'm sure the living conditions weren't really nice, but it wasn't on the order of what happened at Nordhausen. The other people who were used quite commonly up here were Italian prisoners of war. In fact, if you go and look at the pictures of German prisoners at Pointe du Hoc, you'll notice that they're in Italian uniforms. They were Italian prisoners of war, still in Italian Army uniforms, working building those gun bunkers over at Pointe du Hoc. So the workforce there, it was forced labor. In French, it's called STO, but it was not on the. It wasn't of the nastiness that occurred months later.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. This may be embarrassingly sophomoric, but if the geography behind Omaha was so different than the others, why did they land there? Why didn't they just have 4 invasion beaches?
The reason is, and I haven't shown the other beaches could get inundated, and Rommel did. And one of the maps I didn't show here was the inundation map. One of the efforts done by the Germans to defend these beaches was to inundate the areas immediately behind the beaches to prevent glider landings. The Germans were very, very well aware of Allied airborne forces, and so they went out of their way, especially behind Utah. If you see any of the pictures of Utah Beach, they went and flooded them. They had mixed results elsewhere. They actually tried to flood the heights over Omaha Beach, and they tried flooding the areas behind Sword and Juneau and some of the other beaches. The Allies wanted Omaha Beach because Omaha had those highlands, and there was a good road off of Verville going up to one of the main coastal roads. So it was very attractive from a logistics standpoint. And once again, defenses when the planning was going on, fall 1943, January, February 1944, there's no defenses there. So any of these concerns about, fighting your way up the bluffs and stuff, that's just not a working problem.
Steve, you mentioned rocket launchers. The Germans were using rocket launchers, rocket artillery. I assume you mean naval Werfers?
Yeah.
What kind of ammunition were they using?
What they were using, the Nebelwerfers that were there, Nebelwerfers, for those of you who don't know the term, it's a code word. It means smoke launcher, but it's not really that. It's a big rocket artillery round. They used the German 280/320. There were two They were these frame launchers. They weren't the mobile style launchers. They were just frame launchers. And there were two rounds. There was a high explosive round and there was an incendiary round that fired an incendiary mixture of fuel oil and an igniter. It wasn't really napalm, but on that order, yeah. It was that sort of stuff. And if you read the accounts of GIs down at the Zaloga draw, those things were very much feared because when they go off, they have a soft steel casing, unlike regular artillery. So big slabs of steel, I forget if it was Bradley or Eisenhower, described as being a shovel-sized chunk of steel would come off of the rocket, go spinning around and hit people and split people in half. So they were really, really nasty things. They're not widely reported on, but if you do look at the memoir, because quite honestly, a lot of people didn't survive. But if you go and look at the accounts, you'll see, especially in the Zaloga draw, there's a lot of references to those rocket weapons. They were, later in the day, some units got up there and they actually hit a few of the incendiary rockets and blew the whole thing up. There was an enormous explosion when they finally got the ammo dump.
Steve, when the Allies planned the invasion of Normandy, wasn't it true that there was no plan B? It had to work, and
there actually was a plan B. The sad thing is that nobody's dug it out. I found it some years ago down at the Patent Museum down at Fort Knox, and I didn't have I wasn't down there working on that. I think it was called Operation Sword Hilt. There were other plans. In fact, and I could be wrong on the code name, but there was a plan for Patton's Third Army. And if I remember right, and don't quote me on this, but I think that it was the coast of Brittany down at Quiberon Bay. The Allies were very keen on getting some good port areas, and Quiberon Bay was one of the sites they were looking at down in Brittany. And so there was a secondary fallback invasion plan. But to what extent it was pushed forward, I've never looked into that. I've been very interested in Omaha Beach and what actually happened there. I have not looked into the backup plans. There were backup plans.
Oh, there were?
Yes.
Because the way they've interpreted it, that Eisenhower did have almost like correspondence, almost apologizing if things didn't come out the way everything was planned.
He couldn't have done it right away. For example, let's say that Omaha Beach fails. He couldn't have done Sword Hilt or another thing right away. There was a limited number of amphibious warfare vessels, LCTs, LSTs, all those sort of things. They would have had to go back to England, replanned everything. So maybe we're talking August. It might have been an alternative to Dragoon. So instead of Dragoon happening, something might have happened up in Northern Europe, but we won't know. But there are plans, and they are down there in the archives, just that nobody's bothered to dig them out yet.
Steve, one of the criticisms of the invasion was that in the preparation, the medium bombers were supposed to put their bombs on the defenses, and a lot of the bombs wound up in back of the defenses. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, that incident is well known, but let me explain what happened. They used medium bombers over on Utah, B-26s. And that was actually very successful. If you read the German accounts from Utah, the B-26s came in at a lower altitude, around 10,000 feet, bombed the beach defense over Utah Beach, did an awful job on the beach defenses, really ripped them up. That's one of the reasons that Utah had so few casualties, that the air bombardment was so successful. What happened on Omaha Beach is that the Air Force said, well, Omaha's going to need a lot more bombers, so we're not going to use medium bombers from low altitude. We're going to use B-24s from the 8th Air Force at high altitude. Now, the problem is, of course, D-Day is cloudy. There was a storm the evening before. When the B-24s go over, they have very explicit instructions. The explicit instructions is you have to visually sight the beach. That doesn't happen. So instead, they use pathfinders with H-2S radar, and they say, the bottom line, the ne plus ultra, the absolute minimum that they have to do is they cannot allow the bombs to fall on the troops. And so the bombardiers and those Pathfinder bombers release late. And they do it deliberately. There's no secret there. They knew that they were way, way, way behind the beach, and they released, and boom, 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 boom. So you can understand why that particular thing happened. What comes back, and what some Army historians argue, is that it was a fundamental mistake how the Air Force planned to bomb. Because if we have the beach located like this, the bombers were coming in perpendicular to the beach. So they get one pass and that's it. What the Army was expecting they were going to do is go parallel to the beach. So if you're parallel to the beach, you can just keep raining bombs down on it. As long as you're right over the beach, the Pathfinders can see that. You can boom, 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 and go right down the beach. So there was the criticism there. That same criticism comes up during the Cobra breakout in July, where the Army says, we want you to come down parallel, and the Air Force says, no, we're doing it perpendicular. And the Air Force argument is, there's too much flak. Well, I mean, I showed you that map there. The Germans had 488s in that whole sector. And they were facing, I don't know, several dozen B-24 bombers. The Air Force really didn't like tactical missions like this. They told Eisenhower as much. There was a big, Eisenhower said that the one time he thought about resigning was in February, March 1944, before D-Day, where he was having the arguments with Spaatz and everybody. And he finally had to get Marshall to sit on Spaatz and the air commanders and say, if Eisenhower says that you're going to do this, you're going to do this. There were tremendous arguments over the use of strategic air power for tactical missions. Very, very, very bitter arguments.
You and I had the honor of doing the Polish campaign about 25 years ago.
Longer than that, longer.
Longer. Well, it was well regarded. It's still a good book. My question is, everybody knows that this was an important battle. How decisive was it? Specifically, how many Americans died on D-Day at Omaha and on the whole day? In comparison, for example, in the first 5 months of the Russian campaign, 15,000 Russians a day died. How many Americans died on 6 June?
You just made the point that the U.S. Army is a lot more efficient with its manpower, and Victor, I am dead serious about that. I read Russian. I spent a lot of time working through the Russian records. The Russians had appalling practices as far as manpower was concerned. They did the same thing with equipment. I'm working on a book right now on tank warfare on the Eastern Front. If you look at Allied tank losses in the West versus Russian tank losses, the Russian losses are appalling. They're 8 or 9 times higher than the German losses. And even if you take the Eastern Front, you take German casualties versus Russian casualties, the Germans are suffering what, 1 for 6, 1 for 8, 1 for 12? Judging the value of a campaign on the basis of casualties is not very sensible. I don't mean to say that Russia didn't play the critical role in the European theater. I'm not going to make that argument. But making the argument based on casualties, I think, is facetious unless you understand the Red Army. And I understand the Red Army. I spent a lot of time on that issue. I spent time on the issue of the Red Army, not only in World War II, but in more contemporary times.
Could argue, and I asked the question. The German losses were 1/10 of the Russian losses during those first months. And the fact is, the Operation Barbarossa was defeated, and so was Operation Typhoon, before we even entered the war. My understanding is that less than 3,000 Americans died on D-Day. Is that what you have?
Oh, it was less than 3,000. The total U.S. casualties were, depending on who you count and how you count, were around 4,500. But that's casualties. That's wounded and killed. And of the killed, it's probably down under 1,000. It's probably less than 1,000. Yeah, I mean, if you want to make the point that the Allies suffered, I mean, take a look at what total U.S. losses were in World War II. They were in the high 300,000, low 400,000, depending on whether you count the Pacific and, some of the other theaters. The U.S. did not take high human casualties during World War II. The argument that I would make is that the Eastern Front was a battle of iron and blood, and the Western Front was gold and brains. If you look from the German perspective at where they were spending their money, the Germans weren't spending their money out in the East. There were no radars out in the East. There were very, very small advanced fighter formations out in the East. The Germans were spending all their money, their Navy, their Air Force, a lot of their high-tech stuff was being spent in the West. They were spending their blood out in the East. Their casualties happen out in the East, but all their high-tech stuff, all their defense procurement is aimed at the West.
Steve, you mentioned earlier that issue of the 12th SS that Rommel had wanted to put behind Omaha. And I recall Rouge has that map in his memoir where he talks about, I think Panzolaire was going to be behind Utah or something like that, and the 21st. What have you discovered that adds to or enlightens us more about that whole story? Secondly, many years ago I was looking what Ryan had assembled for Longest Day. And it sort of struck me, here's a guy who was subsidized, I think it was by Reader's Digest or something like that.
It was Reader's
and
Digest.
Basically had paid researchers to go do tremendous amounts of work that's sort of unusual for somebody at the time. And I remember he was looking at Zimmerman's, that whole series that came out.
The FMS series.
The FMS series. But after looking at that, I got Gordon Harrison before he died to talk. He was a retired guy up in Vermont. And I was asking him that very question about the German stuff, and he sort of gave me the impression that they did have, access to these kind of materials, obviously not in the depth or what you have dug out, but it's just sort of, I just wondered what your thoughts of those kinds of issues are.
Let me tell you a few stories just to amplify that. The Ryan stuff is wonderful, and it's one of the I shouldn't say unused, but underused resources for military historians of the Second World War. I was using the collection last summer. I did a book for Osprey in the campaign series that's coming out this summer on the U.S. side of Market Garden, the 2 U.S. airborne divisions in Market Garden. So I went out to Ohio University, where the Ryan collection is kept, out in Alden, and went through his stuff. And he's got marvelous stuff out there, and it's a real resource because only a small fraction of that stuff got into his books, into The Longest Day, and got into Bridge Too Far, and got into his other books. And he has a lot of German stuff in there that didn't get anywhere, that didn't appear in print, because you can only put, to give you an example, for Bridge Too Far, he has 50 archive boxes of stuff. It's a vast collection. He has a vast collection on D-Day. So yeah, it's a wonderful resource, but I'll tell you another couple of stories. Pluskat, the one guy that he did interview, there's very, very few interviews with Germans from Omaha Beach. Cornelius Ryan did interview a number of Germans, but they were mostly down on the other beaches. They were down in Sword or Juneau or wherever, or over on Utah. There's very, very few that come out of his interviews. I'm not talking the FMS ones, but his interviews. There are some, like the Zimmerman one, but that's in the FMS series, not with Ryan. Pluskat is the guy who everybody knows, The Longest Day, the movie. There's a guy sitting in a bunker, this officer, and he looks out through the view slits, and there's nothing out there. Oh, it's just fog. There's nothing out there. Oh my God, there's 1,000 ships. And he calls back to his headquarters. Oh, there's 1,000 ships. Oh, you're crazy. There can't be 1,000. Oh, God damn it, come here and take a look. Great scene. And Ryan has that interview. It's the battalion commander, Major Pluskat. Okay, fine. So it's a great story. So you think he's sitting there right on Omaha Beach. Well, to begin with, he's not on Omaha Beach. He's in Resistance Nest 59, way, way, way down the coast. So yeah, he would have seen the ships, but he would have seen it from a distance. There's a second problem. The German veterans say that Major Pluskat was not sitting in the bunker in WN 59. He was in bed with his girlfriend behind the lines. And there was actually a libel suit in Germany over this, because one of these guys who wrote the memoirs, Severloh, was going around to all these German veterans meets and saying, "Oh, Major Pluskat, you're full of shit. You weren't there. You were with your girlfriend back behind the lines." And there was a libel suit over the whole issue. So we have to be a little bit careful. And I'll tell you another story. This is entirely speculative. One of the 2 memoirs that we have from WN62, Severloh, this guy that we mentioned, that I mentioned, he claims that he was firing an MG42 during the day there. Now, let me back off a moment and describe what his role was. He was the orderly to Lieutenant Frere King, who was that young forward observer down in that bunker. Now, what is an aide to a forward observer? What's he doing with an MG42 machine gun? An MG42 machine gun is a crew-served weapon. There's a minimum of 3 men. There's the loader, there's the gunner, the loader, and the loader assistant to carry the ammo. I mean, there's a lot of ammo associated with an MG42. What's he doing with an MG42 on Omaha Beach on D-Day? Is that a story, or because his story keeps getting more and more detailed, and he kills more and more Americans as the years go on? And it's the problem with dealing with oral history, especially when you're in a situation like dealing with Omaha Beach, where the oral history is so thin. The best source, if anybody wants to look into it, is actually in French. The town of Vierville actually has an excellent website, and they have a large number of interviews, because as German veterans would come to the beach, the local town would try to conduct interviews. So there's actually some very, very nice German interviews that don't appear in most places that are on the website. So it's another productive source of study if anybody's interested.
Yeah, 2 quick questions. The ethnic composition of the 352nd, I understand that something like an 1/8 of the POWs captured in Normandy were either Russian or Ukrainian or from the Caucasus. So was the 352nd purely German? And the second question is, was Utah and Omaha in the original Cossack plan, and what happened and why wasn't it?
Starting off with the ethnic composition issue, those the foreign troops, the so-called Osttruppen who were captured, well, I shouldn't call them Osttruppen, let me explain something. Besides ethnic German troops in the units in Normandy, there were 2 other groups of troops that served in German divisions. One of them were the so-called Volksdeutsch. And what it was basically is that during the early part of the war, the German army would recruit people of German ethnic background who were raised outside of Germany, typically in Hungary and in Romania, because there were large German communities there. They would even recruit, after they got into Russia, they would recruit Volksdeutsch from the Russian communities, the so-called Volga Germans. What happened as time went on is that as the Germans get more and more desperate for troops, they start recruiting people who early in the war would not be considered Volksdeutsch. And that means Czechs, Alsatians, and Poles. And so if you were in the western Polish provinces, in Poznań or in Śląsk or in those areas, you had a pretty good chance of getting recruited. In the 716th Division, the static division that formed the initial layer of the defense there, 60% of the troops were ethnic German, 40% were Volksdeutsch, and most of the Volksdeutsch were Polish. They came from various recruit waves, mostly Polish. Now, the 352nd was a regular, what's sometimes called an attack division. Those were not supposed to be laden out with all these, pardon me, really crappy troops. The German High Command was under no illusion about how these Volksdeutsch would fight. And so they would try to mix these troops in and stick them in bunkers and stuff because they assumed that they wouldn't be very loyal. And they weren't. I mean, if you read the American accounts, the Polish troops would throw up their hands as soon as they could. And then strangely enough, they'd end up in the 1st Polish Armor Division fighting the Germans later on in the summer. So, long, complicated story. The other type of troops that are there are the so-called Osttruppen. Now, that's an entirely different kettle of fish. And what the Osttruppen are they are units recruited out of Red Army prisoners of war. And basically what it was is that if you were a Red Army prisoner of war in 1941 or 42, you were dead meat. The Red Army prisoners who were captured in 1941, hardly anybody survived. The Germans just let them die in the camps. So millions of Russian Red Army soldiers died in the camps in 1941, early 42. A little bit later on, once the war is no longer a fast blitzkrieg war, once the Germans realize it's going to be a long battle of attrition, they suddenly start realizing they better be more careful about manpower. And so they start going into the ethnic Red Army units, and by that I mean the non-Russian elements of the Red Army, and they try to recruit them to serve with the German Army, in many cases in auxiliary roles. So they go down to the Caucasus, or they go to troops from the Caucasus, Georgians, they go to the Cossacks, they go to some Ukrainian units, or they try to form some Ukrainian units. So they try to form these Osttruppen units using these ex-Russian prisoners of war. They basically say, you can stay here in the camps or die, or you can join the Wehrmacht and the Osttruppen and at least get fed. So a lot of Osttruppen end up in Normandy, because the other thing is the Germans don't want to use them on the Eastern Front because they figure that they're just going to desert and go back to the Red Army. So the Osttruppen are not common on Omaha Beach. There's very few Osttruppen on Omaha Beach. On Utah, on the other hand, there's a Georgian battalion. So you will see a significant number of Georgian troops picked up there. I just finished up a book on the Cotentin-Cherbourg battles for Osprey in the campaign series. A lot of Osttruppen up in the Cotentin Peninsula. Like 3 or 4 regiments worth. So a lot of Osttruppen up there. But 716th had a lot of Volksdeutsch, but Volksdeutsch in the weak sense of the word. Now I'll throw in one other little thing for any of you movie fans. How many of you have seen the movie of the Korean soldier who fought at Omaha Beach? Okay. One of the strange things is that in dragging in all of these Osttruppen, there were a small number of Korean soldiers or Korean citizens, young Korean men, who were recruited into the Japanese army because Japan was occupying Korea. They were drafted into the into the Japanese army. They fought in the border battles, which you'll be hearing about with Nomonhan and all that. They fought against the Red Army as part of the Japanese army. They got captured by the Red Army. They got sent into the Gulag. Some of them ended up in Red Army service. So this is Koreans who went Korea, Japanese Army service, Red Army service. They got captured by the Germans. They got labeled as Osttruppen, and they got shipped off to Normandy. There's a picture in my book of one of these guys, or at least it's claimed to be one of these guys. And the most expensive South Korean movie done today, done by one of their big special effects masterpiece guys, is a movie about that guy. And I forget its name because it has different names depending on whether you have That's it. The American title is My Way, the Korean one is different, and the European one's different. It's a fun film just for goofiness, but the thing I enjoyed most about it is the depiction of the Atlantic Wall, which makes it look like the Atlantic Wall and the Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line. Oh, spectacular! If the Germans had that much concrete, they could have concreted their way over to England. They wouldn't have had to invade. But it's an interesting movie. So for anybody who likes that kind of stuff. Cossack units fall under the heading of Austroppen. Oh, the plan Cossack. Oh, sorry. The Cossack plan changes through time. The early version of the Cossack plan does have Omaha Beach. It does not have Utah. Utah was a later addition. And there's a variety of reasons for it. One of the reasons is that Montgomery looks at the early plan and just doesn't think there's enough force going ashore. So he wants more force going ashore, and Utah is added largely for that reason. That he just felt that the early plans were like 3 divisions, whereas the plan that is actually executed on D-Day is 5 divisions. Montgomery is very concerned. And getting back to this German doctrine issue, the Germans are going to counterattack very, very quickly. That's the big Allied fear. So they want to get as many divisions on shore as quickly as possible, and follow-on divisions also. I mean, they're landing divisions later on D-Day. I mean, on Omaha, there's elements of 2 divisions right at the beginning of the day, but there's other elements of other divisions coming ashore later in the day. And that's certainly the case up on Utah, and it's the case on the British beaches. They're very, very concerned about those German counterattacks. That's also the reason that the U.S. troops go with so much stuff on them. You've seen, in the TV documentaries, that all of the U.S. troops have 70 or 80 pounds of gear that they carry onto the beach. Well, the reason is nobody expects that Omaha Beach is going to turn out the way it is, a bloodbath like that, where they're going to fight so hard. They expect I don't want to say they expect them to walk ashore, but they expect it's going to be a relatively light fight against relatively light resistance. They're going to go up on the heights, they're going to dig trenches and wait for the German counterattack. And that's why everybody's so grossly overloaded with gear. I mean, U.S. tactical doctrine is not to have your guys go into intense, small-scale fighting carrying 80 pounds of stuff.
D-Day. Was it enough to drive Rommel over the edge? The 1 month after D-Day, Hitler survived an assassination attempt, and that Rommel was somehow connected to the assassination attempt. And that later, then Rommel committed suicide. So I wanted to know, was D-Day the thing that drove him over the edge?
D-Day, Rommel by that stage of the war was pretty much disenchanted with Hitler's leadership anyways. I mean, he was a loyal soldier, but he was very much concerned that Hitler was leading Germany the wrong way. And that was not an uncommon viewpoint. The follow-on commander, von Kluge, was also connected with with that plan. Those senior commanders weren't at the heart of the plan. The heart of the plan was the Ersatzheer, the replacement army back in Germany. Some of those officers, like von Kluge and Rommel, heard about the plan and simply didn't report their contacts with the mutineers, and therefore they were basically going to be executed. And so in both cases, in von Kluge's case and in Rommel's case, they both committed suicide. In Rommel's case, he of course was injured. He was moving around in his private vehicle one day, and he was strafed by a Spitfire and seriously injured. He was in the hospital, and at that stage, Hitler basically gave him the honorable option out. You can commit suicide and take the honorable way out, or we're going to try you and hang you, and we'll prosecute your family. So in that circumstance, he took the honorable way out and committed suicide. Von Kluge committed suicide under much more murky circumstances.
What were the casualties at Omaha Beach compared to the other beaches? But what were specific the casualties at Omaha Beach?
If you want the specific numbers, you're going to have to go to my book.
Yeah,
I don't remember those kind of numbers.
What I'm saying is, compared to the other beaches, what were the casualties, and why do you think they were? I know it's your main purpose of your book, but why do you think they were so high at Omaha Beach? The second question is about the Special Operations Group. What Special Operations people, the paras, the rangers, the climbers, the gliders, how effective were they at Omaha Beach?
They had no, well, let me back up. The question of why the casualties were so high at Omaha is the course of the talk. They were high because of all of these factors, the artillery, the greater density of German troops, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to go over those grounds. The casualties on the other 4 beaches combined were less than Omaha Beach. Omaha's casualties were out in the area, depending on how you count it, 2,500, 3,500. The other 4 beaches combined were less than that. But it gets sticky because do you count the fighting once you get off the beach? Because the Brits get off the beach relatively quick and they get involved with 21st Panzer Division, all sorts of things. So it's a counting problem. Getting into Special Operations Group, it's not a Special Operations Group. The paras and all that, now we're all into all the Special Operations stuff. In World War II, yeah, the paras were treated different than a regular infantry division, but they weren't considered something above and beyond the regular infantry troops. They had a different mission. In the case of Omaha Beach, the paras have no role. There are paratroopers who end up near Omaha Beach just because the drops in some cases were sloppy. The main effect that the paratroop drops have on Omaha Beach is that comp group that I mentioned from one of the regiments of the 352nd that got sent off in a wild goose chase to hunt down paratroopers. So it weakened the German defense in Omaha Beach. The only other special operations that have anything to do with Omaha Beach is Rangers. There were 2 Ranger battalions, Rudder's group, which had 2 battalions, the 2nd and the 5th. They went against Point du Hoc. They were primarily intended to go and deal with the battery at Point du Hoc. What ended up happening is that when the first wave landed, they did not radio back, and therefore several of the companies that were in the follow-on wave were sent into Omaha Beach. And so one of them went up, it gets too complicated, but in any event, one of them went up those cliffs up near Resistance Nest 74, one of the great unsung bits of heroism of the campaign. They clawed their way up the cliff, got up into WN 74, and shot up that resistance nest, which is what weakened the German force in the Vierville Draw. One of the severely underestimated accomplishments on D-Day. The other battalion, most of the other battalion went up alongside Koda's troops from the 116th, went up on the other side of the Vierville Draw, very important for building up the momentum to get past the Vierville Draw. So the Rangers did play a role. It was a secondary role, and they were used just like regular infantry. Gliders are part of the Airborne Division. Glider is just a separate, an organic element of the Airborne Division. And there's no gliders in the Omaha Beach area. The 2 Airborne Divisions are landed back behind Utah. 82nd and 101st goes down behind Utah.
You had talked about the fact that the Allied planning pretty much wrapped up by the early part of 1944. Was there any follow-up in the interim between the end of the planning and June? Or did they just kind of say, okay, we're done, and they moved on to something else?
They did. I don't mean to suggest that the Allies were, completely fixed. And had they learned that the 352nd was sitting there, they probably would have done something. And the best example of that is if you look over in the Utah Beach sector. The Germans moved 2 divisions into the Utah Beach sector. They put in the 90th Luftland Division, and they put the 243rd. 243rd was over on the western shore of the Katan Peninsula, but the Luftland Division was stuck right behind Utah Beach, right where the airborne was going to land. And when they saw this, they said, oops, we can't drop the airborne right in the middle of a German division. And so they changed. If you look at the early plans for 82nd and 101st Airborne Division, and you look at what actually happened at D-Day, they did change the plans for the 2 airborne divisions to take account of the movement of the Luftland Division into the area behind Utah Beach. So yeah, they were flexible about that. I don't mean to suggest that the Allied planners were inflexible. The problem is they didn't know that 352nd moved forward. And in my book, I explained, and I don't know if you have any interest, the reason that they didn't understand why 352nd was there is everybody now knows about satellites and all this stuff. But back in the old days, you didn't have satellites and things to fly over and take all these pretty pictures. And the other traditional means, SIGINT, signal intelligence, was no good in this kind of circumstance. The Germans understood signals intelligence, and all these units that are down in Omaha Beach do not have radios. They are not communicating internally with radios. They're communicating either by courier or by field telephones, and Allied intelligence can't pick up their signals. So when you talk Ultra and all that stuff, Ultra gets picked up off of radio signals. If there's no radio signals, there's no intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance can be done. You don't need satellites. You can do aerial reconnaissance with airplanes. The Allies did do that. They did it very thoroughly. World War II divisions like this don't have a lot of stuff. So when 352nd moved forward, they didn't have a tent city where they were all living. They lived in French villages. They just took over a barn or they took over somebody's house. So when you fly over with an aircraft, you don't see anything that's drastically different. You do see the fortifications. The Allies did know that the fortifications were getting stepped up. That's why there was Hobart's funnies. That's why there were a number of things done. I didn't get into the U.S. side of the funny story. There were actually a lot of efforts made by the U.S. to build funnies to attack the bunkers, but that's another story. Then the final part of the story is the other traditional method for intelligence is spies. The Allies had very good spies in Normandy, the French resistance. The French resistance was very thorough. Up to about March 1944, the Allies are getting a constant stream of intelligence back. Guess what happens? The Germans are no fools. They're trying to break these cells. In March 1944, they break the cell that's sitting in Omaha. They get one guy. They get a courier down in Paris. The courier rats on the ring up in Normandy. They get those guys. They torture them. They rat on other people. None of those guys survive. I mean, in my book, I've got a list of several of the people who were involved. And the cells are basically cleaned out. The cells that are connected to people who have radios. There are some radios up in the Omaha Beach, the Normandy area. Those cells are all policed up by the German military police. They have one other way to talk to the Allies, and that's carrier pigeons. And we don't think in this modern age that people, or in World War II, that people use carrier pigeons for transmitting information. In fact, they did. The Allies were dropping in homing pigeons into the French resistance in Normandy. The Germans also knew about this because the Allies were doing some other pigeon stuff. I won't get into it. I described it in my book. But in any event, the Germans set up pigeon patrols. And so along the Normandy beaches, there are pigeon patrols. And I have a chapter in this book called The Pigeon Patrol. And 352nd shoots down 27 pigeons. Amongst the 27 pigeons that they shoot down are several pigeons with the messages that 352nd has moved forward, because the French knew that the 352nd had moved forward, and Point du Hoc. Point du Hoc, after the first bombing by A-20 medium bombers, 3 of the guns were damaged or destroyed, and 3 of them were intact. They pulled them away from Point du Hoc several kilometers back into the headlands. They were completely ineffective. The Allies didn't know that. So they staged that big Ranger raid, even though those guns were essentially ineffective. So the German pigeon patrols worked. So that was the intelligence side of that whole issue.
Thank you. This is absolutely amazing, the presentation. 3 quick points. First of all, what does the devil refer to in the title? Number 2, can you speculate on what would have happened on the Eastern Front or on the other fronts if D-Day hadn't happened? Like what would be like the balance between the Red Army and the German Army? And number 3, given all what we have learned from Second World War, do you think it would be wise to start World War III? Should Russia invade eastern Ukraine?
Okay, I'm not going to deal with question number 3. That's a subject for a whole. I will say that my next book for Osprey that I'm going to be working on next year is going to deal with the final campaign of 1945. I'm doing a book for Osprey in the campaign series covering the last month of the war. So read that book when it comes out 3 years from now, but I'm going to skip that one. The desperate in the title refers to the fact that Rommel didn't have the forces necessary to defend Normandy. You know, we look at all of these bunkers and all this other stuff, but if you go back and you look at it from the German perspective, it was a desperate defense because they knew that they didn't have enough defenses. The scheme that he came out with, this tactical plan to put everything up on the beach, was a tactic of desperation. It was not a well thought out plan, and Rommel understood it. He did not have enough forces. The German army didn't have enough forces. They had to do the best with what they had. It was a desperate gamble. He knew that the other tactics didn't work, therefore he tried this. He had no great expectations it was going to succeed. As far as your second question on the other fronts, I'd rather phrase it a different way because I think it's the what-ifs are impossible to answer. What did D-Day accomplish? And I think that the most important thing that D-Day accomplished occurs several weeks later on the Russian front, and that's Operation Bagration, the destruction of Army Group Center on the Russian front. That is one of the key battles of World War II, far more important in many respects than D-Day. It basically blows open the German defenses on the Eastern Front. What had been happening since the invasion of Sicily is that the German army on the Eastern Front had gotten weaker and weaker and weaker. Kursk gets called off in the middle of the offensive because the Allies land in Sicily. And everybody looks, oh no, that's just Hitler's excuse because Kursk was going badly. And that's not the case. What happened when the U.S. invaded, or when the U.S. and Britain invaded Sicily, is Hitler fully well understood that the Italians were going to pull out of the war. What happens when the Italians pull out of the war, which happens in September 1943, they take 80 divisions with them. Now, you say 80 Italian divisions, you think desert campaign. Of those 80 divisions, about 40 Italian divisions are stationed in the east. They're used as occupation troops in the Balkans and also in Russia. So suddenly, in the middle of Kursk, Hitler realized he's going to lose 40 divisions, which is not inconsequential. The German army at the time is around 150 divisions. So starting with Sicily, the German army starts going weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. Hitler, in the spring of 1944, when he's deploying new production tanks, new tanks to the various fronts, they all go out here. All the tank strength that's out in Normandy is tank strength that was pulled out of the east. All those divisions were divisions that were out in the east. So the reason that Bagration, the Destruction Army Group Center, is so successful in the Russian sector, on the Russian front, is D-Day plays an absolutely vital part in weakening the Wehrmacht's overall strength on the Eastern Front. So if I was going to draw comparisons, it would be more the ill-considered or seldom considered effect that D-Day has elsewhere, rather than the theoretical what if it fails. It's too hard to describe all the possible permutations of what might have happened. No, the German army at this stage of the war is in bad shape.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I have a five-part question. Part one.
And 6 subsections.
Yeah, thanks. No, thanks for doing your stuff with the footnotes and appendices and things like that. I love that type of research. Have you motivated anybody else to do stuff like that, and what are you doing next based on that?
I don't know. John McManus's book on the 1st Division at Omaha Beach, I sent John a copy of the manuscript, so some of John's work on the German side of Omaha Beach is based on this. And it's like anything, until you put the stuff out in print, people aren't aware of it. I mean, my response here, I don't work primarily on the German army. I did this book largely because I've read all of the U.S. accounts. And the problem with so many of the U.S. accounts of the U.S. Army in World War II are monolingual. The people who write them only read English sources, and they don't bother to look at the other sources. And quite honestly, the most useful sources I found for this book were not German language sources, although I have a lot of German language sources. It's actually French. The French publish a tremendous amount of stuff on Normandy. There are entire French magazines devoted to D-Day and the Normandy campaign. There's wonderful, wonderful material out there in French. So I was motivated largely because I felt that one of the shortcomings of most U.S. military history dealing with World War II is the monolingual nature of the sourcing. So I'm hoping it'll. My German isn't very, very good. I don't mean to claim I'm any wonderful German specialist, but you got to look. So what I'm hoping to do is tell people, if you want to do histories of World War II now, you got to go and look at the German side. You can't write all these histories just based on U.S. records or British records. You got to go look at the German records. Oh, I was going to show you the two. I will quickly throw in the 2 bonus ones. Nobody asked about this, so I'll do this one fast. This is just a mapping of the naval bombardment. I could get into it, but I'm not going to. There is a new book out called the Omaha. What's it called? The Omaha Cover-Up. It came out of England. It's written by a guy, I think his name is Gary Stern. It's been percolating around for a while, but he has been claiming that there's a whole bunch of gun batteries located in this area, and he was claiming that they could hit Omaha Beach, and that nobody talks about it. The batteries are called the MyZ batteries, that's the real secret of Omaha Beach. And I actually did this slide because, as I said, I gave this talk over at Sandhurst. I figured that the British audience would know the Stern argument and they would ask me about it, so I prepared for this. But this is an American audience, not aware of the British stuff. But basically what I wanted to show here is there's Verville, and this is the German artillery map showing, ooh, can't quite hit Verville. So the cover-up is not quite as mendacious as might be suggested.